Okay, hi, hello. You know why we are here. It's to talk about July anticipated releases, which means we are officially halfway through the reading year, which is mind-boggling. As usual, I put together a list of books I am personally anticipating for whatever reason that we're going to talk through. I am going to miss some. As usual, I thought I would have a little bit more of a conservative curated list for this month, and then I just kept adding books. So let me know what you're excited about, whether it's on this list or not, and let's get excited about books together. Before we jump all the way in, and as I'm realizing I blend in with this wall for different reasons today, I don't talk numbers very much on this channel, and though I've started giving out kind of like an obligatory subscribe if you feel like it at the end of every video, because everything is always if you feel like it, we are inching closer and closer to 1,000, as I've mentioned a couple videos. So if you feel like liking, commenting, subscribing, whatever your heart leads you to do, it's appreciated. And as I always say, I appreciate you being here regardless, and I'm sure I will reiterate it at the end because I'm Midwestern. But with that, let's go ahead and jump into the books. Now, our first release day is actually July 4th, and I was honestly a little surprised to see any books on this day since it's technically a holiday. It's kind of tricky because you only have so many release Tuesdays in a year, and now we have one falling kind of awkwardly, especially during the kind of prime summer reading months. However, based on this July's lineup, I haven't really gotten a sense of what kind of books publishers are positioning in July, because it seems like we're like in the midst of summer reading, but I've been noticing that a lot of the books that they are really anticipating being big summer reading books, things like Happy Place, romantic comedy, some of the big thrillers, they've released a month or two out to kind of help it gain momentum going into the summer. And with that, my first book on the list this month is actually technically a re-release of an already published title, and is something that is kind of indicative of a bigger industry trend we are seeing in romance that I might do a deeper dive on at some point, but self-published romance isn't really my expertise area, and it involves publishers, romance publishers, picking up previously self-published titles, picking up previously popular and successful self-published titles, and giving them a traditionally published release. There is obviously a lot we can dig into there, but the book we are talking about in this moment is The Wall of Winnipeg and Me by Mariana Zapata. I read my first Mariana Zapata just this year. My romance book club and I read Culty, and I talked about that in one of my monthly wrap-ups, and I did really enjoy it despite it being longer for a romance novel because of its kind of self-published origins as well, and I talked about that in that wrap-up as well and kind of how I viewed that and experienced that as a reader. But I'm very interested. I'm also interested because it looked like this had a paperback release from, I assume, the author in relation to the self-published title. And that cover had a very traditional, as I view it as a reader, kind of sports romance cover to it. This follows based on the blurb, and I recognize that many people have already read this book, so sorry if I get any of this wrong in my interpretation. A personal assistant of a very famous, popular football player who quits after 3 years, and he goes and begs for her to take the job back in some fashion. So that original cover was very sports romance to me. This cover is moving into that kind of cartoon cover trend that we've talked about in terms of kind of romance trends right now. And I don't know how I feel about it, to be completely honest. I mean, the book is the book. I think there's this assumption or the intent for this cover and this publisher to help this book find an even wider audience, but it already has a pretty wide readership. I do believe that this means that it will probably no longer be in the Kindle Unlimited program. I am not an expert on Kindle Unlimited, so don't quote me on that, but I also know that there is a lot of discussion going on about Kindle Unlimited right now. So that being said, I will probably pick this up, though I don't know in what time frame, because it is supposedly, according to its listing, over 600 pages for a romance novel. And I think that there is also a conversation there. Kindle Unlimited titles in their historical pay structure have really rewarded longer books. And I also think if you're moving into something like Kindle Unlimited from reading something like fan fiction, you were probably used to that kind of longer, drawn out, kind of angsty, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I love me some angst, especially in fan fiction, kind of plotting. And so then that translates into the kind of books you're seeing being published. And then I think that leads to some of the disconnect disconnects between different types of romance readers, but that is a much larger conversation, as I said, and we don't have time for it. I've already wasted too much of it here, but this is definitely on my radar for the month. And then staying in the realm of romance, we have Business or Pleasure by Rachel Lynn Solomon. This is the author of The Ex Talk and Weather Girl, both titles I really enjoyed, so I'm very anxious to read this one. It follows a publisher who has a kind of disastrous, feels like a strong word based on the blurb, but a one-night stand that is best left in the past for whatever reason. And then she is ghost writing a new book with a new client, a kind of child star now famous on certain con circuits, and come to find out this actor was her one-night stand and what leads from that. So honestly, I'm probably going to be picking this one up purely on my enjoyment of her first two books. Then we have the first of a couple heist books for the month, The Housekeepers. This follows a group of downstairs women, a housekeeper, a seamstress, an actress, a black market queen, according to the blurb, as they attempt a heist on the grandest ball of the social season. It's a historical fiction. It seems like it's going to be exploring some class dynamics and maybe an inversion of some of the things I personally enjoy in historical romance, but recognize the fantasy of at the same time. So think that this may be a lot of fun. I have not read anything by the author, and the only thing I am seeing on their Goodreads is mainly golf books, which is not really my interest area, but I'm interested to see what this is gonna be. And then we have July 9th, the surprise release day that took the internet by storm a couple of months ago. Was it a couple of months ago at this point? Basically, on TikTok, a couple of booksellers kind of leaked that, hey, we've got this unknown book publishing on July 9th, which you might be like, okay, sometimes placeholders are there for books. What's so special about it? Well, July 9th isn't a Tuesday. And as you probably know, if you've ever been a bookseller or are really deep in the book community, new books are released on Tuesdays, except for James Patterson, at least historically, was released on Mondays. If that has changed, please let me know. So this is a Sunday. What is coming out? And the rumor mill got going. People were speculating that it was a Taylor Swift biography, which to me personally never really made sense because we are getting Speak Now on the 7th. And while they are different mediums, it just seemed like a conflict to me in terms of attention for the brand that is Taylor Swift. But then because her name was invoked, we were getting a lot more buzz around it, and people were coming out anonymously to kind of put out the fires and saying it's not a Taylor Swift autobiography. But then people were speculating what would be big enough to be on that release date, and that led many to coming to the correct conclusion that this is a BTS book in honor of their 10th anniversary, Beyond the Story 10-year record of BTS. I have this on my radar mostly because the majority of my close group of friends are ARMY. Actually, my friend Dana has a TikTok account where she does the news every day and cracks jokes about BTS. So I have been on the periphery of all of this for many, many years and know that this is going to be a really anticipated title. I was actually texting with Dana about it when we were kind of speculating that this would probably be what was going to be released based on how the dates were lining up. And I was particularly interested in this, as I've said before, in relation to Elliot Page's memoir, in that I am interested in what could go toe-to-toe with Spare come the end of the year Goodreads Choice Awards, and like what would be an actual competitor for that title. And if it is put in the same category, I would think that this BTS book would be an actual competitor for Spare. So I'm very interested to hear what the reception of this book is. I anticipate that it's going to be good because it seems like it's a celebration, but I will be mostly interested to hear what my friends think if they pick it up and what the reception is there. So if you are ARMY, you already know about this book. I'm not telling you anything new. And if you're not, now you won't be surprised when you see this book skyrocket up the lists. And then we're moving on to July 11th. We have Queen of Exiles by Vanessa Riley. This is a historical fiction looking at the life of Haitian queen and exiled Queen Marie-Louise Christophe after the Haitian Revolution and being forced to escape to Europe. So it's looking at her and her daughters and how they move through society. It looks like it's going to be a bold and exciting historical fiction, part of the legacy of reclaiming the stories of these important historical women that have been kind of footnotes to now. And also here looking at the lives of strong, successful Black women amidst Western society in the age of colonialism. Well, we are still in the age of colonialism, or dealing with the impacts of colonialism, but that historical time. I have also personally been meaning to read and need to get back to Island Queen, which is another historical fiction in this vein from Riley, and she also has some historical romance as well. So I am hopeful based on that there will be some romance peppered in here, but it's the lives of these women, so it'll be what it'll be. But I'm also excited to see how her voice translates to historical fiction as a reader. And then let's stay in historical fiction for a second with Half-Life of a Stolen Sister by Rachel Cantor. This is a fictionalization of the lives of the Bronte sisters. I do not believe we are touching on Branwell Bronte here, their brother, so we are focused on Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. I did find it interesting because the blurb mentions Agnes Grey in relation to Anne instead of Tenant at Wildfell Hall. Also of note, I did get into another heated discussion about Wuthering Heights a couple of weeks ago at a backyard barbecue. Alcohol had been consumed. We ended up yelling about Wuthering Heights. We had differing opinions. It was great fun for me, I'm not gonna lie to you. So this is looking at the lives of these three sisters. And so one, I'm very interested in what the context of Stolen Sister is in relation to this book, but also looking at the cover, it makes me think of string theory. And then in the blurb, it talks about kind of like shifting into different modes of storytelling and kind of exploring these different realms. So I'm wondering if we are actually going to be kind of looking at this story through the lens of string theory in some way, or if that's going to be kind of a storytelling into it, which I think you kind of need at this point. The stories of the Brontes have been done. I am here for stories of the Brontes, but you need to have like an angle into the story, something that hooks you. And this feels like it's going to be both an exploration of their work, them as people, an appreciation of both of those things, but then also experimental in terms of the form and using that to kind of underscore something larger as well. So I'm very, very interested in what that is going to be. And then we have The Duchess Effect by Tracy Livesay, which is the sequel to American Royalty, which is a romance. And this isn't like in the same world like you would in a traditional romance series where we are following new characters. We are still with Danielle Duchess and Prince Jameson in this book. And so it's kind of looking at them navigating their relationship after the events in book one. And I'm not going to lie to you, I am nervous about this book, especially because I saw a review from a TikToker I really trust who had some issues with how miscommunication was handled in this book. And I have also seen some really excellent conversations around the concept of miscommunication, specifically in romance recently, in that miscommunication is common. And we've touched on that here before too. Like, miscommunication happens. That's kind of like one of the major faults of us as humans in some ways. And so, of course, it's going to be really important in these stories where interpersonal dynamics are really what's at the heart of things. But the way that this TikToker, and I can't remember in this moment, I'm so sorry, was describing it, it had the nuance of feeling like just something that was being held back on Danielle's part for the sake of stakes or dramatic action. And so I'm not sure, especially if it's going to become a trend of romances having sequels. Like, I think it comes down to, is there more story to tell? And if we are playing in the realm of romance, does this impact the happily ever after of book one? I'm not asking these as like leading questions at this point. I actually am thinking about them myself. So something to consider, but definitely going to pick this up, especially because I'm interested in this trend anyway. I do still need to read Husband Material, the sequel to Boyfriend Material, because that's kind of playing in a similar realm, but I do think these are different publishers. I believe American Royalty is Avon, and I believe Boyfriend Material is Source Books, so that says to me that we might have a larger industry trend, or that the industry is trying to kind of feel something out on a larger scale. Not sure yet, but definitely going to keep my eyes on it to see if there's more to discuss there in the future. And then we have A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Irwin, which follows a heroine who has been recently widowed after marrying someone 20 years her senior, an earl 20 years her senior, and she has existed in this marriage that would not have been her first match for a decade. And when her husband dies, she sees this opportunity for freedom as a widow and to kind of live her life on her own terms, until that living her life on her own terms gets back to the new Earl of Somerset. And she may have known this new Earl of Somerset, which feels like such an obvious statement because presumably it was family to her late husband, but I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know. But there was some encounter 10 years ago or more with these two. There's some history there. So we have a recently widowed woman with this world of opportunity and freedom in front of her, and a man from her past that is probably, one, gonna learn about the power of a recently independent woman, and two, maybe gonna learn some feelings based on the fact that this is a romance novel. Then we have The Curse of Saints by Kate Dramas. This has the potential, based on the blurb for me, to be really good or to fall pretty flat, because the blurb is kind of vague, but it also has a lot of pieces that I really like, because it seems like we have this butting of heads between two characters. We have a spy from the Queen's Guard, Aya, and a bitter rival, the Queen's enforcer, Will, so there is some antagonism there. They are forced to work together to come to a truce, and then Aya unleashes some power that maybe complicates things, and then also there is that hint of magic. I don't know, for some reason while I'm reading this blurb, because it's not exactly by any means, nor should it be, I'm getting vibes of like Poison Study, which I loved. So I'm hoping that this may be something that gives me like a similar feel. I admittedly really do love like rivals to lovers kind of tension, especially in fantasy romance. So the trick with this, I think, is going to be how much does romance play a piece in this, because it's either going to need to go all in or it's going to need to be balanced a little bit more delicately, I think. However, based on the blurb, it really feels like they are forwarding the romance of it all. And then it's going to become a piece of, is the world that is being built around all of this strong enough to kind of help support that? Like, does it feel active and engaging enough on its own, or is it just kind of a backdrop for this? So I'm not saying that that is the case. That's just always kind of like my concern in terms of like fantasy romance that really, really works for me, and fantasy romance that is a little bit more middle of the road for me. But at the same time, if it's done well, even if it's middle of the road, I'm having a good time. So I'm very intrigued by this one, despite knowing basically nothing about it, so I think that's why I'm hedging a little bit more here. And then we have a young adult book, Love and Resistance by Kara H.L. Chen. This follows a young girl, Olivia, who is a little bit of an introvert. She's at her 4th new school in 7 years, and she kind of keeps to herself, and that is a protective barrier in some ways. And then one day in class, the kind of queen bee of the school makes a racist comment toward her, and it enrages her. And instead of just ignoring it for the sake of survival, she decides to fight back. And in doing so, she learns about the existence of this underground group, the NerdNet, I believe. And this group has been working to undermine this queen bee's authority. So it sounds like a fun takedown while exploring some important themes as well. And then we have Thief, Liar, Lady by D.L. Soria, which is another book that has the opportunity to really hit or really miss for me, I think. This is a reimagining of Cinderella. It is blurbed for fans of Naomi Novik, so I'm hoping that it will hit for me. But it's looking at a much more calculated Cinderella who is in league with the stepmother and stepsisters and getting one over on the prince. But on the other side of this success, magic is running out. It says war is looming in the blurb, so some kind of political unrest. And our Cinderella figure may be catching feelings for a prince that is not our Prince Charming. So very interested in the world this is going to build out. I will especially be interested, I think, in the tone of voice to this. Like, is it kind of humorous? Is it very serious? And then like making larger statements based on that. I would lean probably into expecting a more kind of dry and or sarcastic blend of humor in this, but that is purely speculation. So very interested in this, what conversation it's having with fairy tales, what conversations it's having with Cinderella in particular, and how that fits within the larger context. And then we have The Sea Elephants by Shastri Akela, which is blurbed for fans of Shuggy Braun and of Burning, which tells me it is going to be an emotional ride and there will be tears. So I don't know when I'm going to get to this, despite the fact that I've been seeing a lot of buzz around this title, a lot of praise for this title. It follows a young boy that, after the death of his twin sisters, flees his father's disapproval and his mother's grief to an all-boys boarding school, but doesn't feel like he fits in there either, and ends up in a traveling theater troupe. And there he thrives, telling stories of gods and mortals and the Hindu tales of his childhood. He meets a photographer, Mark, and has the love he's longed for right in his grasp, and then it becomes a matter of facing his past, the fears of his past, whatever history is there, as well as his father in terms of claiming his own happiness. So very intrigued by this. The blurb is beautiful, the cover is beautiful. I'm particularly intrigued by the idea of this character being part of a traveling theater troupe, and especially the Hindu stories that they're enacting, and whether that will play a piece in the narrative itself and how that will be told. So there is a lot of potential here. There is also a lot of potential for my heart to be absolutely decimated. And then we have The Center by Aisha Manizar Siddiqui, and this I am drawn to for its cult potential yet again. It follows Anisa, a Pakistani translator who dreams of working with great works of literature, but yet has been working mostly in translating Bollywood movies. And she meets Adam, a translator who has gained a lot of acclaim and mastered many languages, who introduces her to The Center. And The Center is an exclusive program that promises fluency in a language within 10 days, but it requires isolation, and there is something more going on there. I'm also intrigued by the blurb and some of the conversation I've seen around this book, intimating that it is exploring kind of the colonialism of language in some ways. So I think it may be a great book to read in conversation with something like Babel, while it's also giving me the kind of mood from a different angle of something like Natural Beauty. So very interested in this for sure. And then moving on to July 18th, we have my most anticipated book of the month, Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia. If you've been around for a while, you know that I have been a big fan of Silvia Moreno Garcia since Gods of Jade and Shadow, and especially since Mexican Gothic, which I think is the book that really helped launch her to most readers. And I am very excited about this one. This one feels like it's going to be close tonally in some ways to Velvet Was the Night. It's set in Mexico City in the 90s. It revolves kind of around an unfinished cult film that kind of focuses on Nazis and occultism, and so there are so many different angles to it. I am so excited to see what Silvia Moreno Garcia brings to this, and I'm constantly in awe, as I've said before, of how she is able to kind of approach so many different kinds of books and storytelling. They all have some element of kind of weird to them, but to varying degrees. Maybe there's magic, maybe there's not. I think there may be magic here because it's going to be delving into the realm of occultism, but I don't know to what extent. And honestly, I really haven't dug much into this title because it is Silvia Moreno Garcia. I know I'm going to read it. I already have it pre-ordered, so I'm eagerly anticipating this showing up to my apartment, and I will dive in as soon as I'm able. And then we have To Have and to Heist by Sarah Desai. This is a heist novel, as indicated by the title, where our protagonist Sammy is helping regain a stolen necklace whose theft has been pinned on one of her best friends. And so she's putting together a crew to recover this necklace, and she's also teamed up with a man who has offered to help for a cut of the reward. And so I'm very interested in this for a couple of reasons. One, the balance of everything, or maybe mostly the balance of everything, because it seems like we are going to be setting up a crew in this novel for this heist. It doesn't appear like it's a series, but I know historically Sarah Desai has been a romance author, and it seems like there is still going to be a romance piece to this, or that is going to be the most forward thing. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how we balance the romance with the other characters in this heist crew, how the heist of it all plays out, how much it's part of the story and built out, whether we're setting up a longer series here down the line. I don't know. I'm very interested. And also to see kind of how humorous this is, because I anticipate, based on the balance of things here, the mix of romance and heist, that there is going to be a certain amount of humor there. So I guess we'll see, but that is the second heist novel we have for the month. And then we have Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. Yes, that Chuck Tingle. This is their first horror novel, and this is a horror novel taking place at a conversion camp. And while I have not read any of Tingle's romantic work, I do know their Twitter persona a little bit at least. I'm very interested in how this fits into Tingle's body of work as it stands, because based on that, I would expect a certain amount of irreverence. However, it is also tackling a really important and horrific subject. So I will be very interested in what the tone of this is, as has been kind of the refrain this month, it seems. But I think that this is going to be one to watch. I think based on their body of work as it stands, I think this has the opportunity to be a really engaging, pithy, kind of sarcastic read of the situation while being really insightful and searing at the same time. So I think there is so much opportunity with this, and I'm very interested to see what this is going to be. I also anticipate this reigniting a lot of discussions around the entity that is Chuck Tingle online. And then we have Charming by Jade Linwood, which is another kind of twisting breaking of the fairy tale mold this month. This is more in the John Tucker Must Die vein, where our Prince Charming has been moving from damsel to damsel to rescue them, reap the rewards, take over the kingdom in whatever way, and a couple of our damsels have finally had enough and band together to take down Prince Charming. So I think this also has the opportunity for a kind of fun, sarcastic almost. Maybe I'm thinking most of a kind of Christopher Moore updated tone and voice to things. So very interested to see what this is going to be, and very interested to kind of keep an eye on where we are in the kind of current fairy tale discourse, how we're reimagining them at this moment, how we're in conversation with them at this moment, because fairy tales are never going to go away. Their reimaginings are never going to go away, but it's also very interesting at any given moment how we're interacting with them. And it's never going to be across the board, right? There's always going to be variations. But if we're seeing an uptick of this, what is that indicative of? I surely don't know, but let's keep our eyes on it. And then we have A Twisted Love Story by Samantha Downing, author of My Lovely Wife, which I started on audio and never finished because I just wasn't in the right mindset for that particular kind of audio and never got back to it. But it is a highly popular thriller, and this feels like it's going to be in a very similar vein of a brand of thriller where we are following people that are unlikable, that we are not necessarily supposed to be rooting for any given reason, and invested in them and watching them being awful people. And this follows a couple in a very toxic relationship, that kind of typical cycle of toxicity, but they are tied together by the secret that they are connected to a murder, and they are united in this despite their toxicity and the on-again, off-again nature of their relationship by uniting against a common enemy, this detective that is on their trail. So we'll see where that goes, and I ultimately don't have any real insight into where that may go because I never finished My Lovely Wife. If you think I should go back to My Lovely Wife amidst my never-ending TBR, let me know. And then we have Sammy Espinozas' Last Review by Taylor K. Mejia. This follows Sammy, a protagonist who is a music reviewer but has gotten into some hot water at work and has one last chance, one last review to kind of save herself. And this leads her to Max Ryan, a former rock god who is supposedly producing a new album. This is notable because he's been kind of out of the scene for a while. Unfortunately, right before he left the scene, he shared a night with Sammy and also left her ghosted. And not only is he recording a new album, but he is recording a new album in a town that Sammy has family ties to and a lot of history with. And so amidst her life that is already on fire, she kind of has to face this past in a couple of different ways, which of course gives us the opportunity for rock star romance and second chance romance. So we will see what we get here. And then we have Sinners of Starlight City by Anika Scott, which is set during the Chicago World's Fair, but is not touching, at least to the blurb's intimation, on H.H. Holmes. But it is, according to the blurb, touching on a lot of other history at the time, both in Chicago and the world, as well as what it means to be biracial at the time. And so I'm very interested in what new angle of Chicago at this time it gives us amidst this backdrop of the World's Fair that is already so evocative. So very interested in this from a historical fiction angle, as well as like a popular paperback historical fiction angle, which sounds weird to say, but it feels like there's a certain brand of historical fiction that goes straight to paperback that feels like ready to be read at the beach. And it feels like most often those stories are really veering into the World War I, World War II narratives over the last couple of years. And by last couple of years, I mean almost a decade. So this just feels like a fresh setting and fresh themes and ideas to explore. Very excited to see what we're digging into here. And of course, I'm not speaking in absolutes ever. There are a lot of really engaging historical fictions that are not World War I and World War II that have come out in the last decade. There are a lot of engaging historical fiction titles that are World War I and World War II that have come out over the last decade. It's just not what I personally gravitate to first, so it's nice to have some options. But speaking of wars that show up in narrative a lot, let's go all the way back to the Trojan War with Horses in Fire, a novel of Troy by A.D. Rhine. This feels like it is going to be a reimagining of the Trojan War through the perspective of women associated with the Trojan War. The blurb itself seems to call out most specifically Andromache and Rhea, so we'll see if we get more than that. I'm also going to be very interested in how it frames itself, especially having read a couple of years ago, I think, at this point, A Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes, which is also a reimagining of the Trojan War through the perspective of the women impacted by the war and whose stories are often framed historically around the men of the war. So it's that kind of recentering of the women of the Trojan War. And so I think this is also part of a popular trend since Circe of kind of reclaiming and reimagining those stories, particularly the stories centered around women. This trend, if we want to call it that, has led to varying levels of success for me personally as a reader, so I'm very interested to see where that sits amidst these retellings, which I don't anticipate going anywhere soon, especially knowing that Madeline Miller is working on a Hades and Persephone retelling herself. And I'm not trying to invoke Madeline Miller in the sense of comparing these books to Circe, because I don't think that's fair to these works that should be able to stand on their own or that we should be considering on their own. But I also think it is important to look at things in larger literary trends and why certain books are being bought and who they are being marketed to. So that being said, we'll see what we get here. And then we have Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong, which I thought was part of her young adult series, but isn't. It is her adult fantasy debut and is a retelling of Antony and Cleopatra. So very interested in this. I admittedly have not read her young adult work, despite it being immensely popular. Sorry, Laura, you know how it gets once it's down far enough in the TBR and you're trying to crawl your way back out. So I might start here, but at the same time, I know less about Antony and Cleopatra from the Shakespearean standpoint than I do about Romeo and Juliet, where we are in the young adult series, at least at the start from my understanding. So I don't know. I'm very interested in this. I don't know anything about this beyond the fact that it's Chloe Gong, it's her adult debut, and it is a reimagining of Antony and Cleopatra. But it also might be fun going in not knowing much, so we'll see on this one. And then we have The Deep Sky by Yun Katasi, which has been buzzy for a while, but in wake of certain recent events, feels extra pertinent in a similar way to when I see people watching my review of Our Wives Under the Sea right now. I'm like, oh, well, there we are. But this follows a group of like 80 people who have been put on this ship. They've gone through this rigorous process to be selected for this ship to go to this somewhat habitable planet. And they are basically going to be repopulating an entire generation on this ship. But after they've left, there is an explosion that kills 3 of the crew and sets their ship off course. And so this of course breeds distrust, people are turning against each other, and there's also the worry that this could happen again. So there's an effort to find out who is responsible for this, what is going on as the kind of social order of things on this ship starts to deteriorate. So there's going to be that sense of claustrophobia, the sense of the unknown. It seems a little sci-fi, a little horror, and in light of recent events, it's probably going to read a lot more pertinent to people than it may have even a month ago, unfortunately. And then we move on to our final release Tuesday of the month with The Sun and the Void by Gabriela Romero La Cruz. And this follows 2 young women, Reina and Eva, as they are kind of unwanted in some way, fighting for their life in some way amidst magic and gods and coming into their own power and into themselves. There is a promise of romance here as well, but I am very interested in the magic system that this seems to be setting up, in what the fantasy is digging into, and in its exploration of South American folklore. So this has the potential to be really lush and vibrant and a wonderful kind of exploration and celebration of coming into your own, coming into your power, coming of age in many different ways. So very, very excited to see what that's going to look like in this one, and what the kind of fairy tale world of this is going to feel like, especially as we are pulling from presumably non-Western tales. And then speaking of books kind of exploring or pulling from fairy tales or mythology traditions that I personally am not as versed in, which admittedly is my kind of personal perspective, so I do have lots of gaps there, I will admit that. We have The Weaver and the Witch Queen by Genevieve Gornichek, who wrote The Witch's Heart, which was a reimagining of Loki mythology and a recentering there of women's stories as well. And so this is following 2 women in Norway amidst the Viking Age as their lives kind of intersect and what their futures and their destinies look like. I assume this is pulling from specific stories, mythology, something, but that I'm not familiar with it. So if you know what this is a retelling of, if it's something in particular, please leave that below as well. But I'm very interested to see what Gornichek follows up The Witch's Heart with, because I thought that that was a really engaging book. I really enjoyed it, and I will be interested to see how this one reads. And then we have Not That Duke by Eloisa James, which is the 3rd in the Would Be Wallflower series, which is also the perfect opportunity for me to knock out this entire series in one go, because despite Eloisa James being one of my go-to romance authors historically, I am way behind on this series. However, this is billed as an enemies to lovers romance, which we know I love. It follows a young woman who is being pursued for her dowry. She ends up married to this duke, according to the blurb, for all the wrong reasons. I presume if we had been reading the series, or if I had been reading the series, I would have a lot more context here. But once they are married, this duke then has to convince her that he has fallen in love with her. So we have that enemies to lovers dynamic, we have that marriage of convenience dynamic. It's got everything that should work for me, so I'm very, very excited for this one, but I obviously have to read the other two before I can get here so that I can properly appreciate it. I'm sure if you want to just go here, you can. You won't be any worse for the wear, but knowing myself, I do want to read them all, especially because I already own the first one anyway. And then we have How to Tame a Wild Rogue by Julie Ann Long. This is number 6 in a series that I haven't read. I'm actually not as familiar with Julie Ann Long, and despite saying with Eloisa James, I'm gonna go back to number 1, I think here I might jump right in here and then see if I want to go back to number 1. What caught me in the blurb here is that our hero has kind of fought himself up the ranks in St. Giles, and so it kind of makes me think of the Bare Knuckled Bastard series, and our heroine here has supposedly been ruined in some manner. She comes across our hero on the docks. There is a downpour, and you know what that means according to romance rules. They escape to a boarding house, they pretend to be man and wife, feelings of different natures may develop from there, the stakes raise, and they have to decide if forever is in the cards. But it's been a while since I've read a good escape from the weather force proximity plot, and I am here for it. And then finally we have House of Roots and Ruin by Aaron A. Craig. This is the sequel to House of Salt and Sorrows, which I read in 2019 and loved, but will need to revisit before I tackle this sequel, though it is following one sister very closely, the sister who hasn't had her curse broken. So the book seems to be about the sister Verity living outside of the realm of her sisters for the first time, finding out that this curse is still impacting her, how it does impact her, amidst her kind of trying to claim her own life in some ways, a budding romance in some ways, but I'm anticipating, based on what I remember from the first book, still having this kind of dark gothic feel to everything. So I'm very interested in what that's gonna look like here. I'm very interested because it seems we're going to be moving to a new location, having a little bit of a different setting, and how the kind of gothic tone of that is going to translate. If it does, what that's gonna look like, all of that. So intrigued by this as much because it's a surprise as anything. So with that, that rounds up our somewhat more conservative July. Lots of titles still. Personally, my 2023 specific TBR is still out of control. Let me know if yours is looking the same. Let me know what out of these books you're excited for. What books didn't I touch on that are releasing in July that you're excited for? Let me know. Like I said, like, subscribe if you feel like it. As always, just thanks for hanging out. Read something good, and yeah, bye.